A family mysteriously disappeared from their home. A group of men thought that the perpetrators were fierce Indians. But unfortunately, what they faced was not a human, but a terrible underground creature. At the beginning of the film, there was a couple of men and women who were in a serious relationship. The man was named Fergus, while the woman was named Marianne. Fergus gave a souvenir to Marianne as a form of his seriousness. At that time, Fergus could not stay there long because he had to return to work as a laborer at his employer's house. Marianne lived with her parents, and that night they experienced a serious problem. Something was attacking the small settlement. Their neighbors warned Marianne's family to immediately take shelter in the basement. They still didn't know what creature they were facing. The atmosphere became increasingly tense until a hand broke through the wooden door above them, and since that night, they have disappeared, who knows where. A few days later, Fergus came to visit Marianne, but all he found was the rotting body of a man. Fergus came with his senior named Clay, one of the best shooters ever at that time. I don't know what happened to Marianne's family, but what is clear is that violence occurred, and Clay felt that this must have been the work of an angry Indian tribe. On the other hand, there was a woman with her son named Dobie, and a man named Parcher. Parcher was not part of their family, but it was known that Parcher was trying to approach Dobie's mother to be his wife. A few moments later, a man came on a horse from a distance, and it turned out to be Fergus. Fergus happened to know Parcher and gave him a letter. The letter came from Clay, asking for help from Parcher, who was experienced in investigations. He was asked to investigate Marianne's family, who had disappeared since a few nights ago. The initial suspicion was that they were kidnapped by the Indian tribe. Parcher came with Dobie. Although he was still a junior, Dobie was quite reliable. Parcher saw several bodies of residents there, one of whom had a scar on his neck like a small knife cut. While outside, Fergus saw a strange hole. Clay came with several small troops led by Henry and his trusted Indian. This case turned out to make Henry quite surprised and interested in helping Clay and Fergus. Some bodies have been buried, then they start traveling to find the whereabouts of Marianne's family. Fergus gets a new friend here named Walnut, not his real name but an alias. On their journey, they see an Indian who looks confused with his horse. Henry, who has no mercy, then shoots the Indian's horse and then takes the man hostage. The man is asked for information to find where they are holding Marianne's family hostage. Unfortunately, the man only said that they were in danger. The night would be their grave. Of course, that statement made Henry furious and ordered his men to torture him. Among Henry's troops, it turns out that Walnut was kind enough to provide assistance to the Indian man, even though it was only limited to food and drink. Unfortunately, when Henry saw the Indian man eating heartily, it made him angry and upset. No one was allowed to go against his orders. Seeing that condition, Fergus didn't want his new friend to be hurt, so he lied that he did it. Initially, Fergus was going to be finished off, but Clay and Parcher stopped him so that it didn't happen. That night, they finally slept while some troops were on guard. But one of them became a victim of a mysterious creature emerging from the bushes. The next morning, Henry tried again to ask the Indian man to tell him where they kidnapped Marianne's family, because it did not produce results. In the end, Henry decided to end their search and return to headquarters. While Clay, Parcher, Fergus, and Dobie also decided to do their own search. When they were about to leave, they saw the same hole again. What hole was that? The journey began. They rested at night. Then something appeared from the darkness. It turned out to be Walnut. He separated himself from Henry's group because he felt uncomfortable with him. So he wanted to join Clay and the others looking for Marianne's family. The next day, they went back on the journey and saw the hole again. Not far from there was a wagon abandoned by its owner. At first, they thought it was the work of the Indians again, but the items above were still intact. There was something wrong here. They stopped for a moment to rest. while Dobie was surprised to accidentally find some kind of human hair on the ground. At first thought it was horsehair, but it turned out that a young woman's head was found intact with her body stiff. Surprisingly, the young woman was still alive and breathing. Only her body became very stiff and could not move. Even blinking and closing her eyes could not. In the end, they decided Dobie took the young woman to the doctor for treatment, while the rest would continue the search. On the way, they saw several Indian houses that had been burned down. Who knows who did it, but there were no signs of life. They started to enter the forest and felt someone was watching them. Parcher saw at a glance that they were Indians. Whether they were good or evil, they clearly had to be vigilant. Until one of the Indian men raised his gun up as a sign of greeting or welcoming. Unfortunately, Fergus did not understand and fired his gun at them. That's where the gunfight happened. Luckily, it seemed like the number of Indians was small, so the gunfight stopped for a moment. But when they started walking again, a shot was heard and aimed at Clay. Clay was shot in the neck to death. Walnut was trapped in his horse, which was shot dead, while Parcher and Fergus fought against the Indians. They took cover behind Walnut's horse. From there, they managed to defeat the Indian troops one by one until they retreated. Meanwhile, Dobie also stopped walking because the night was getting closer. He decided to spend the night there. But unfortunately, that night, he was attacked by a monster that emerged from the ground. The monster slashed Dobie's neck and put poison into his body. So Dobie immediately became paralyzed and stiff, but he was still alive. Dobie was buried alive in the ground. Who knows what the purpose of the ground monster was doing that? On the other hand, Parcher and the others tried to survive and tried to escape using a diversion. They burned plants and leaves so they could escape. But the problem doesn't stop there. One night, Parcher was attacked by a ground monster. Fergus and Walnut tried to save Parcher, but Parcher had already been cut on his neck. The poison had started to enter Parcher's body. He began to feel his hands stiff. Even part of his face became very heavy. Parcher was lucky the poison that entered his body was little, so he could still survive until he was completely stiff. They went on a journey again and met an Indian woman. The woman told about a ground monster called burrowers or earth diggers. The monster would attack soft or weak parts, one of which was the neck. After becoming stiff, the monster would bury its victim for a few days, then eat it. The monster could also track the whereabouts of those who had been cut on their necks. That meant Parcher had been marked and couldn't go anywhere. That was also what would happen to Dobie and the young woman. Only Parcher understood the Indian language. Unfortunately, he kept this a secret from Fergus and Walnut. Slowly, Parcher's face began to worsen. Part of his body also began to be difficult to move. That night, they were attacked again by a ground monster. Parcher, who was not on target, actually shot Walnut's leg. After the monsters started to leave, the Indian woman asked them to leave the place and leave. She also told Parcher to be left behind. However, Parcher seemed to not accept it and wanted to shoot Fergus. Luckily, Fergus didn't have the heart to do it and brought Parcher, even though he was in a worrying condition. Then they met two Indian men. Initially, they looked good, but it turned out that he took Parcher to be used as bait for the earth monster. The two Indian men said that they didn't need Parcher anymore because he was useless. Then one of the Indian men threw a necklace with several items including souvenirs that Fergus had given to Marianne. His search for Marianne was over. Here, Walnut invited Fergus to come back and treat his leg, but Fergus decided to save Parcher. Fergus did it alone. He had a shootout with one of the Indian men and finished him off. Then he saw Parcher on a tree trunk, unable to stand. When he was about to take him, Parcher took Fergus's gun and shot it at the other Indian man. Fergus was shocked and accidentally hit by a bear trap. Then the ground monsters appeared and began to eat Parcher's body. At first they didn't realize the presence of Fergus and the Indian man. However, one of the monsters began to approach Fergus and tried to inject poison into him. Fergus fought the monster even though he was less fortunate. The Indian man also helped Fergus clean up the monsters. One by one, Fergus made sure that there were no more monsters left alive, until morning finally came and the sunlight burned the bodies of the monsters. Fergus came out of the forest carrying an Indian man. He said that the man could show them where they could find an antidote to the monster's poison. Because Walnut couldn't come along, Fergus went to find help himself. He met a group of people. When he had received treatment, Fergus returned to Walnut and his Indian friend. Unfortunately, Henry found them and killed them. There was nothing else Fergus could do. The hope of finding an antidote was gone.